India resumes the export of its COVID-19 vaccines. The Serum Institute will be sending 1 million doses to Nepal, Myanmar and Bangladesh. This comes after a temporary ban during the second wave of the pandemic. The United States staves off a credit default that could have sent the global economy into a tailspin as Washington DC's warring political factions agree to a stopgap fix to raise the nation's debt limit. The United Nations Human Rights Council will appoint a special rapporteur on Afghanistan to probe allegations of violations perpetrated by the Taliban and other actors involved in the country. And Philippines journalist Maria Ressa and Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov win the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. We'll come on to all those stories in a moment, but let's start though with some news coming in from Afghanistan, where a blast has taken place at a Shiite mosque in the northern city of Kunduz. Afghanistan's Interior Minister spokesman Qari Syed Kosti has confirmed the explosion, which targeted the Syed Abad Mosque during the Friday prayers. According to reports, dozens of people have been killed by the blast. However, there are no firm details on the number of casualties. This is not the first time that bomb attacks and explosions have marred Afghanistan, even recently. Last Sunday, for example, an explosion took place outside the Eld-Gah Mosque in Kabul, which killed at least 12 people and injured 30. WION's correspondent Anas Malik joins us for the latest developments from Kabul. Anas, what are the latest you can tell us from the ground in terms of what's happened and casualties?
Well, carnage, it's how it can be described, Benji. What has happened in Kunduz today, in the Imam Barga in Saidabad, which is the capital of Kunduz. A suicide bomber, it is said that a suicide bomber had exploded himself during the Friday prayers at the time when the mosque was packed. Now, as we speak, there is no official figure on the number of casualties. There are dozens which can be seen injured and dead in those gruesome footages that have come out. However, local media and sources are telling us that at least 30 people are confirmed dead and several are injured, with the caveat that this number can increase by at least 2 to 3 folds as well. Benji?
And what about the Taliban? What are they saying about this deadly blast?
Well, the Taliban have come out with a statement. They have confirmed that indeed a blast took place at an Imam Barga, it's a Shiite mosque, during the Friday prayers, and that their units are there on ground. From what I have gathered from local sources is that they have been making announcements at the blast site, at the scene of the explosion, asking people to stay away from here because they fear that another explosion can possibly take place. Now, this is a chain of explosions that have been happening. We saw one happening just 5 days back here in this capital city of Kabul, outside a mosque as well, that was claimed by the Islamic State or ISKP. As we speak, this explosion has not been claimed by any organization as yet. But the Taliban say that they are making efforts to secure the country. Their USP, or that unique selling point of the country being secure, has badly taken a hit because over the past few weeks we've been seeing attacks taking place, be that be in Jalalabad, be that be in the capital city of Kabul, and now in Kunduz. So clearly the Taliban are feeling the heat. They are saying they're trying to ensure security, but despite of that, we're seeing the Taliban that this blast taking place, which is going to serve as a major blow to that rhetoric of the Taliban that they have indeed secured the whole country following their takeover. Benji?
Anas Malik with the latest for us from Kabul, and we'll keep up with the developments from that story as the day progresses here on WION. Next today, some brighter news for international travellers. Britain has decided to scrap its tough COVID-19 quarantine requirements for 47 countries, and one of those is including India. Those vaccinated with the WHO-approved Covishield in India will now be able to travel to the UK from October 11th and will not need to quarantine for 10 days. This quarantine rule has been a bitter bone of contention between the two countries. Earlier, India had retaliated by imposing the same quarantine measures for UK travellers into the country. Those fully vaccinated will now no longer be required to take a pre-departure test either, nor the 8-day test after their arrival. However, a COVID test on day 2 of arrival still remains compulsory. For those only partially vaccinated or those who have received a vaccine not yet approved by the WHO, those quarantine restrictions remain, plus a compulsory pre-departure test, a test 2 days after arrival and 8 days after arrival, and self-isolation for 10 days. The British High Commissioner to India, Alex Ellis, tweeted the new rules and thanked the Indian government for their cooperation.
From Monday the 11th of October, a traveller from India to the UK, double jabbed with Covishield or another vaccine recognised by the UK regulator, does not have to quarantine. So it'll be easier and cheaper to enter the UK. This is great news. We have been actually open for Indian travellers for months. We've been issuing thousands of visas to students, to business travellers, to tourists. And it's the product of excellent discussions with the Indian authorities. So let's now go further. Let's open up more flights between the two countries. Let's get British tourists able to come into India. They're desperate to do so. Let's facilitate business travellers who are trying to come into India with e-visas.
The list of 47 countries also includes South Africa and Thailand, but 7 nations still remain in the red list, including Colombia, Ecuador, Panama and Venezuela. British Transport Minister Grant Shapps also says the requirement for the Day 2 PCR test will be replaced to a cheaper lateral flow test instead.
One of the great things now with people fully vaccinated from the UK is it's much easier to allow people to travel and also to accept 37 other countries whose vaccinations we will now be able to accept. We will still want to have that check-in of a lateral flow test, but of course if that turns out to be positive, people will be able to immediately take a PCR test.
The British tourism industry has essentially lost 2 full summers due to travel restrictions imposed to contain the spread of coronavirus. Budget airlines like Ryanair in Ireland and EasyJet have said the changing restrictions have delayed the recovery in the sector, leaving the British airline industry lagging behind its European peers. WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddharth Sibal, has this report.
As they say, all is well that ends well. The UK has announced new travel rules for many countries, including India, under which the Indian travellers will now not have to go through a mandatory quarantine period if they're fully vaccinated. We know the tiff that happened between New Delhi and London over the previous rules by UK, under which the Indian travellers had to go through this mandatory quarantine period. And of course, there was no recognition of India's Covishield vaccine or the vaccine certificate as well. The rules came into effect later on 4th of October, and India was naturally, India had also imposed reciprocal action. There was since then conversations going on between the two sides, hoping that there will be a resolution. Finally, a resolution has come. This is, of course, a positive news for many Indian travellers going to UK. We know that UK has a lot of Indian diaspora, and that has been the living bridge between the two countries.
The United Nations and World Health Organization have come together for a collective goal: vaccine equity. The WHO had earlier set an ambitious goal to get 40% of every country's population vaccinated by the end of this year and 70% by the middle of 2022. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has appealed for $8 billion to achieve this mission. The global vaccine production is currently nearing 1.5 billion doses per month, so there is enough supply to reach the goal set out by the WHO. But it depends on equitable distribution of vaccines. Mr. Guterres pushed the G20 nations to deliver on their mission to get the world inoculated. He even called vaccine inequality the best ally of the pandemic, which could lead to more deaths, further slowdown of economies and cost trillions of dollars in recovery.
Vaccine inequality is the best ally of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's allowing variants to develop and run wild, condemning the world to millions more deaths and prolonging an economic slowdown that would cost trillions of dollars.
The UN Secretary-General also talked about the variant risk that vaccine inequality and inequity brings. Virus spread in unvaccinated people can give birth to new variants which could resist the current vaccines in use.
There is a risk that when they can be very soon, there will be not the Delta, it will be another variant that will be able to resist vaccines. And all the vaccination effort made in developed countries to vaccinate the whole of their population, 1, 2 or 3 times, all that effort will fall apart. And these people will not be protected. So not to have equitable distribution of vaccines is not only a question of being immoral, it is also a question of being stupid.
India has given a green light to vaccine producers to resume the export of COVID-19 vaccines. The Serum Institute of India is set to send 1 million Covishield doses to Nepal, Myanmar and Bangladesh. The pharma giant has also been allowed to supply bulk vaccines to AstraZeneca in the UK. This export is due to a contractual obligation with the London-based firm. Bharat Biotech, meanwhile, will provide Iran with 1 million doses of Covaxin. The export on vaccines was temporarily halted when the deadly second wave of the pandemic hit India, but now the pace of infections and COVID deaths have slowed down considerably. By many accounts, India's COVID wave is receding. In the last 24 hours, the country has reported a little over 21,000 new cases. India has always prioritised the demand for vaccines in its own country, but the Prime Minister has also called for helping India's allies cope with the pandemic. India is one of the biggest vaccine manufacturers in the world, which is why there is growing pressure from other countries like the United States for India to get back to exporting vaccines soon. The Serum Institute is the world's largest vaccine manufacturer by doses, and it produces a low-cost Oxford AstraZeneca shot, which is seen as a lifeline for developing and underdeveloped nations around the world. Google has pledged to invest $1 billion in Africa over the next 5 years to support the continent's digital transformation. The internet giant's investment will be aimed at providing access to fast and cheaper internet and will also back startups and provide $10 million in low-interest loans to help small businesses and entrepreneurs in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria and South Africa.
Google is to invest big in Africa. It's pledged $1 billion over the next 5 years and wants to ensure access to faster and cheaper internet, as well as backing startups fueling the continent's digital transformation. The unit of US tech company Alphabet made the announcement at a virtual event this week where it launched an Africa investment fund. It plans to invest $50 million in startups, providing them with access to Google employees, network and technologies. Google Africa Director Nitin Gadria.
We are specifically looking at fintech, logistics, e-commerce, local language content. But again, we're not limiting ourselves to these verticals. We're really looking at this across a number of verticals. We're looking at areas that might have some strategic overlap with Google and where Google could potentially add value in partnering with some of these startups.
Small businesses in Africa often struggle to get capital because they lack the collateral required by banks in case they default. In collaboration with not-for-profit organisation Kiva, Google will also provide $10 million in low-interest loans to help smaller outfits and entrepreneurs, with a focus on those in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria and South Africa. Google said a program pioneered last year in Kenya with Safaricom would be expanded across the continent. It allows customers to pay for 4G-enabled phones in instalments. Gadria added that an undersea cable being built by Google to link Africa and Europe should come into service in the second half of next year, increasing internet speed and lowering data costs.
Poland is part of the European Union, but lately the country's been asserting its differences with the bloc. In the latest move, Poland's highest court has called some articles of the European Union Treaty as quote-unquote unconstitutional. This could potentially threaten the funding it receives and even its membership within the bloc. The case was taken up after the Polish Prime Minister questioned whether Brussels could stop Poland from reorganising its judiciary, as, he argues, the EU's treaty articles do not align with the Polish constitution.
The Prime Minister's application concerns the relationship between the treaty provisions and the primacy of the Polish constitution, and therefore it concerns Polish sovereignty.
In its ruling, the Constitutional Tribunal says it has a right to check EU laws and even the rulings of European Union's Court of Justice. This indirectly challenges the EU to not interfere in Poland's judiciary. The bloc's Justice Commissioner has responded with a stern warning and vowed to react.
Confronted with a decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, we will react to reaffirm, I don't want to mention again, the main principles on the functioning of the European Union. And that's the goal that we have. We are guardian of the treaties at the Commission level, and we will do what is necessary to try to have a correct application of the treaties. And so that's the main goal that we have. And of course we will do that in a very near future, because we received the decision today, but we will react, of course, in a short period of time.
The past few months have seen a heated dispute between Brussels and Warsaw, ranging from courts and media freedoms to LGBTQ rights. The governing right-wing Law and Justice Party is prompting major changes, mostly conservative in nature. Critics have warned that challenging the supremacy of EU law could jeopardise Poland's long-term future and also the stability of the bloc itself. One of the Polish opposition leaders says that the government is heading towards a polar exit. That's a play on words on Brexit, when the UK left the EU. Apart from the political difference, there are other speculations that Warsaw is trying to put pressure on Brussels to accept the National Recovery Plan, an aid programme aimed at helping EU economies shake off the impact of the pandemic. But the funding is crucially linked to compliance with the EU's law and democracy standards. NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says relations between Russia and NATO are at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War, and Mr. Stoltenberg blames Russia's behaviour for those worsening relations. Earlier this week, NATO expelled 8 members of the Russian mission to the alliance. They were accused of secretly working as Russian intelligence officers. Mr. in line with what he calls an increase in Russian malign activity, which NATO had to react to. Ties between the West and Moscow have slumped in recent years since the Kremlin's 2014 annexation of Crimea and over its involvement since in the conflict in eastern Ukraine.
The relationship between NATO and Russia is at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And that's because of the Russian behavior. We have seen their aggressive actions, not least against Ukraine, but also the significant military buildup and the violations of important arms control agreements, like, for instance, the INF treaty that led to the demise of this treaty that actually banned all the intermediate range weapon systems.
NATO stripped the UN-declared Russian intelligence officers of official accreditation and reduced the size of the Russian delegation to just 10. Russia has long had an observer mission to NATO as part of a two-decade-old NATO-Russia Council. Meetings of a NATO-Russian Council have not been held, though, since 2019 against the backdrop of heightened tensions. Reacting to the expulsion, the Kremlin said that it showed NATO members have no desire to normalise relations with Moscow NATO. Mr. Stoltenberg replied to that by saying NATO is ready to engage in meaningful dialogue with Russia, but so far Russia has not responded positively.
We are ready to engage in meaningful dialogue with Russia. We are ready also to convene a NATO-Russia Council meeting. We have actually invited Russia for now a long time. So far, Russia has not responded positively, and therefore there has not been any meeting in the NATO-Russia Council. But we are ready to meet because we believe that to sit down to talk is always important, but especially important when times are difficult, tensions are high as they are now, and therefore we will continue to strive for a meaningful dialogue with Russia.
And visitors to London Zoo will now be able to see giant tortoises in their natural habitat. Giant Galapagos tortoises have settled in well, zoo authorities claim, at their new home. We'll leave you with this sneak peek. Stay tuned to WION World is One.
Meet Priscilla, Dolly and Polly. 3 giant Galapagos tortoises who found a new home at the London Zoo. They've been living here for over a month. The 3 are said to have settled in well. Since moving in, these tortoises have received several housewarming gifts, such as this delectable slice of watermelon.
So we moved them about a month ago from their old enclosure to this new one, and it's a massive upgrade for them. It's 9 times the size of their previous enclosure, and it's designed to account for the fact that they've grown considerably since they arrived in the zoo. It's much better as well in that it replicates the environment that these tortoises come from in the wild, which is really important for reptiles because they get all of their cues from the external environment.
Their new home has been designed to closely mimic their natural habitat at the Galapagos Islands. Most of the plants are native to the area where the tortoises are found in the wild. Keepers can control the temperature, humidity and light cycles in the enclosure. It is maintained at a tropical 27 degrees Celsius.
We gave them a lot of different food to sort of help them feel at home and make them know that it was a safe place. But as soon as they arrived, they were exploring all the different areas, trying to eat the different plants, swimming in the ponds and using their mud wallow. And they've just looked fantastically happy since the first 5 minutes of arriving.
Giant Galapagos tortoises can easily live to over 100 years. But they have long faced threats from humans. Back in the 17th century, ships stopping in the Galapagos Islands would catch the reptiles as food for their journey. Today, they face modern problems.
These animals are really threatened by existing threats, things like climate change, which is causing more extreme El Niño and La Niña effects on the Galapagos Islands, longer dry periods which put strains and stresses on the population, continuing pressure from invasive species and competition for land with people. So these animals really are threatened with extinction, and because they're only found on these handful of tiny islands everywhere in the world, that puts them under even more stress.
The display enclosure called the Giants of Galapagos opens to the public on October 9th. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
This is right, Arab.